My dad gave me an ultimatum: invite the woman who slept with my ex or he'd skip my wedding. So I replaced him, and when he saw my grandfather walk me down the aisle instead, he lost it. That woman, my sister, the same sister who flirted with my boyfriend in front of me, slept with him under our roof, and never once apologized, not even when I caught them half naked in her room the next morning. Not even after she bragged about it to our cousins like it was some twisted game she won. So no, I wasn't going to let her smile in my wedding photos like she hadn't wrecked a piece of me. And when my dad tried to force her back into my life, he made it clear his comfort mattered more than my pain. That day wasn't just about who walked me down the aisle. It was about walking away from a family that never protected me and finally choosing myself. Growing up, I was a living reminder of everything my father lost. My mother died giving birth to me. It was sudden, complications, blood loss, a phone call in the middle of the night, and just like that, she was gone. My father wasn't even there. He was away on a work trip. He came back to a newborn daughter and a dead wife. According to my older sister Natalie, Dad never really looked at me the same way after that. I was the reason his world shattered. While I don't remember those early years, I felt their weight. I could feel the silence, the absence. Dad was distant, barely there, and when he was, it wasn't loving. It was cold, perfunctory, as if caring for me was some chore he'd been cursed with. Natalie, though, she was everything to him. She was 4 years older, looked like mom, and more importantly, she wasn't me. She got the bedtime stories, the birthday parties, the hugs. I got a nanny, a schedule, and a quiet message I internalized far too young. I was tolerated, not loved. Still, I tried. I followed him around the house when I was little, desperate for attention. I'd show him the drawings I made, hoping for a smile, but he'd barely glance, muttering something like, "Why don't you go play quietly?" It stung every time, but I kept hoping. The dynamic only worsened as we got older. Natalie became the golden child. Straight A's, piano recitals, tennis practice. Dad was always there, cheering, clapping, buying her everything she needed. Meanwhile, I was treated like a spare. If I got a B, I was scolded. If I wanted art supplies, I was told it was a waste of money. When the house needed cleaning, it was me scrubbing the bathroom while Natalie got to focus on her studies. I remember once asking him, why doesn't Natalie have to help with chores? His answer was immediate and dismissive. She's going places. You better learn to take care of a home because that's where you'll end up. It crushed me. I was 12. Natalie, for her part, played along. She saw how the scales were tipped and used it. If something broke, I got blamed. If she wanted something I had, she took it, knowing Dad would never take my side. I once caught her tearing up one of my sketchbooks, saying, "You'll never be good at this anyway. It's just glue and glitter." "Dad?" He laughed when she told him later. But the worst part wasn't the chores or the favoritism. It was how lonely it all felt. I'd lie awake at night listening to their laughter from the living room, wishing I could be part of it. Wishing I was wanted. When I turned 16, I saved up to buy myself a secondhand camera. I'd take pictures of everything: sunsets, stray cats, people on the street. It gave me a sense of control, of framing the world the way I wanted. But when Dad saw the photos, he didn't even ask about them. He just told me to stop wasting time and look into getting a job after school. The one constant during those years was my grandfather, my dad's dad. He lived in the same town and would take me out for ice cream or walks when he saw I needed a break. He never said much about how Dad treated me, but his presence said enough. He saw me. Despite everything, a small part of me still longed for Dad's approval. I remember making a birthday card for him one year, hand-cut, full of pressed flowers. He opened it, said thanks, and tossed it on the counter. Later that night, I saw it in the trash. When I finally left for college, I cried, but not because I was sad. I cried because I was free. No more walking on eggshells, no more being invisible in my own home. I told myself I wouldn't look back, but pain like that doesn't just vanish. It sits under your skin, waiting for someone to press it. And years later, when Natalie pressed it in the worst possible way, I realized how much I had buried to survive. By the time I moved out and started building a life of my own, I thought things with my family would eventually settle into a distant civility. I wasn't asking for love or redemption anymore, just peace. But distance didn't fix anything. The wounds I carried followed me everywhere, and somehow they always found a way to reopen. After college, I landed a modest job in graphic design. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment, paid my bills, cooked for myself, and began dating a man named Daniel. He wasn't flashy or loud, just steady and thoughtful. He listened. And for a while, that felt like everything I had been missing. I believed I had finally started to outrun my past. Then came Thanksgiving. My father invited us, to spend the holiday at his home. It was rare. Normally, I kept my distance. But things between us had softened slightly in recent years, and I naively thought this invitation was a step toward healing. I remember convincing myself that maybe they'll see the woman I've become. Maybe Dad will finally be proud. When we arrived, Natalie greeted us at the door like she owned the place. She always had that air, entitled, untouchable, still living with Dad, still jobless, still dressed in designer labels she hadn't paid for. Her smile stretched too wide when she saw Daniel, and my stomach sank. At dinner, she was relentless. "You're too handsome to be dating my little sister," she joked, giving him a flirtatious nudge. "Where did she find you? Some dating app for miracles?" Everyone laughed, except me. Dad didn't even look up. Later that evening, while I was helping clean up, I caught her whispering to Daniel in the living room. She tossed her head back, laughing at something he said, resting her hand on his knee like it was nothing. When I walked in, she didn't flinch. She just smiled at me like she knew I wouldn't dare make a scene. I pulled her aside. "Natalie, can you not? It's making me uncomfortable." She scoffed. "Wow, jealousy really doesn't look good on you." Then she leaned in and whispered, "Maybe if you knew how to keep a man, you wouldn't have to worry." I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake upstairs, waiting, hoping Daniel would come check on me and ask if I was okay. But he never did. The next morning, the house was too quiet. My gut twisted. I walked downstairs. The couch was empty. His shoes were gone. Something inside me already knew. I pushed open Natalie's bedroom door and saw them, half-dressed, asleep, wine bottles littering the floor, my chest hollowed out. I didn't scream, I just stood there, absorbing the image. That moment burned itself into my memory. When I confronted them, Natalie acted like I was the intruder. "Get out of my room," she snapped, covering herself with a blanket. "You're so dramatic." Daniel muttered something about being drunk, said it was a mistake. I didn't respond, I just turned around and walked out. When I told my father, he barely reacted. He sat silently for a moment, then shrugged. "They're adults. I'm not getting involved." No anger, no remorse, no defense of me. Then came the real punch. "You should have known better than to bring a man like that home. Maybe if you paid more attention, this wouldn't have happened." I wanted to scream. Instead, I just nodded. Of course. It was always my fault. Natalie didn't stop there. She told our cousins I was overreacting, that Daniel had said I was boring, and she just rescued him from a bad relationship. She laughed about it like it was a joke. Like she hadn't just broken the last fragile bond I had with family. That weekend wasn't just a betrayal, it was confirmation. No matter what I did or how far I came, I'd always be the problem in their eyes, the unwanted one, the scapegoat. That was the beginning of the end. I stopped returning calls. I stopped trying to explain myself. Because what's the point of speaking when no one ever listens? My family didn't lose me because of one night. They lost me because they never chose me in the first place. The morning after Thanksgiving was the moment everything unraveled. I stood there in the doorway of Natalie's bedroom, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. Daniel and Natalie were half covered by a blanket, wine bottles and discarded clothes strewn around like props from a scene I never wanted to witness. My body was locked in place, frozen by the weight of betrayal. I had no words. just a rising tide of heat behind my eyes, my chest tight with disbelief. I think they sensed me before I spoke. Natalie stirred first. She blinked and groggily looked up, and when she saw me, she didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She didn't even look guilty. Instead, she rolled over and said, "You could have knocked." Daniel scrambled to sit up, pulling the blanket over himself. "Wait, I didn't mean for this to happen," he stammered. "We were drunk. It wasn't planned." Planned. As if the humiliation I felt could be measured in levels of intention. My voice cracked as I managed to say, "Get out, both of you." Natalie had the audacity to laugh. "Of my room? You're in my room, remember?" She tossed the sheet aside and stood up, completely unbothered, completely smug. "Don't be so dramatic," she said as she reached for her robe. "It's not like you were going to marry him." That line shattered something in me. She knew. She knew what she was doing, and she wanted me to hurt. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I walked out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the house without another word. I left Daniel behind. I left my father's house for good. And I knew I wasn't just walking away from a bad relationship or a toxic sibling. I was walking away from years of denial, from every time I had told myself, "They're still family." When I got home, I blocked both of them, changed the locks, packed away anything that reminded me of Daniel. I grieved the relationship, not because it had been perfect, but because I had let it convince me I was finally safe. And I grieved Natalie, not because she deserved my love, but because I had wasted so much of it on someone who saw me as competition instead of kin. But the worst part, the most bitter cut of all, came when I told my father. I called him later that afternoon. My voice was calm, even though my insides were screaming. I told him what I saw, what Natalie had done. There was a long pause on the line. I remember thinking, this is it. He's going to take my side. He has to. But then he said, "Look, they're adults. I can't control what they do." I blinked, staring at my phone like it had betrayed me too. "She slept with my boyfriend," I whispered. "Under your roof?" He sighed. "It's not ideal, I'll admit, but maybe this is a lesson for you. Be more careful about the kind of people you bring into the family." I wanted to scream. Instead, I said, "Are you seriously blaming me?" "I'm not blaming anyone," he replied. "I'm just saying maybe he wasn't the one. Better to find out now than later, right?" That was the moment I knew my father wasn't just indifferent, he was complicit. He was so afraid to hold Natalie accountable that he'd rather suggest I had brought this on myself. A week later, Natalie posted a photo on Instagram with Daniel captioned, "Sometimes the right one shows up in the wrong way." The comments were full of laughing emojis and fire symbols. She liked every single one. I got calls from cousins asking what had happened. Some already knew. Natalie had told them. She'd twisted the story into something funny, sexy, scandalous. In her version, I was the bitter ex, and she was the irresistible force no man could resist. I didn't respond. I didn't correct her lies. I deleted the app, but the damage was done. People started treating me like I was the problem, like I had overreacted, like I should have expected this from Natalie. Even worse, some people started acting like Daniel was the victim. Caught between sisters, they said, must have been tough. I stopped answering texts. I buried myself in work. I told myself that cutting ties was the mature choice, the strong choice. But the truth, I was devastated. I felt hollowed out, betrayed not just by two people I had trusted, but by the entire system that enabled them. The years of favoritism, the passive-aggressive comments, the excuses, it had all led to this. And now I had to clean up the mess while they posed for pictures. One night, a few weeks later, my grandfather called. He'd heard whispers of what happened and wanted to check on me. He didn't ask for details. He just said, "Whatever they did, it's not your fault." I broke down. I sobbed so hard I couldn't speak. And he just waited, holding the silence for me like a gift. When I finally calmed down, he said, You didn't deserve this. And you don't have to carry their shame. It was the first time anyone had said that out loud. It was the first time I believed it. But my father never called. He never asked how I was doing, never asked if I was okay, if I needed anything, if I was safe. The man who raised Natalie like a princess didn't even send me a text. It was like I had disappeared. And maybe to him, that was easier. The next time I heard his voice was 2 months later when he called to ask if I had cooled off yet. Cooled off? As if betrayal came with an expiration date, as if I was supposed to just get over it. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I told him calmly that unless he was calling to hold his daughter accountable, we had nothing left to say. He hung up without another word. That was the last time we spoke for nearly a year. And honestly, that silence was the most peace I'd ever known. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, not at first. After I cut ties with my father and Natalie, the weight of everything I'd carried for years finally collapsed on top of me. It wasn't just Daniel's betrayal. It was every ignored birthday, every mocking glance, every chore I did alone while they laughed in the other room. It was my entire childhood finally screaming back. I told myself I had done the right thing walking away and setting boundaries. I told myself I should be proud. But pride doesn't keep you company when your phone doesn't ring. When the people who are supposed to love you the most act like you never existed. I started waking up with a tightness in my chest. My thoughts were loud all the time. I'd be washing dishes or scrolling aimlessly on my phone and suddenly feel like I couldn't breathe. Panic would creep up without warning. Sometimes I'd burst into tears at the smallest thing. A commercial, a photo, a song. Other times I'd just feel numb. The worst part was pretending I was okay, pretending at work, pretending with friends, pretending when I passed a mirror and didn't recognize the person looking back. Stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping. My apartment became cluttered with dishes I didn't have the energy to clean and laundry I couldn't bear to fold. My life, once held together by structure and routine, began to fray at the edges. One night, I found myself sitting in the dark on my bathroom floor. I had been crying for over an hour, my phone in my hand hovering over my father's name in my contacts. I didn't want to talk to him, I just wanted to scream, to ask why I was never enough, why Natalie could do anything and still be loved. Why did he stand by and watch me fall apart? But I didn't call, I turned the phone off and cried until my body gave up and I fell asleep on the cold tile. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't keep doing this alone. I found a therapist near my office. At the first session, I barely got a word out before I started crying. She didn't rush me. She didn't ask for the whole story right away. She just let me fall apart in her presence, and somehow that made it feel okay. Over the next few weeks, I began to unpack everything, not just the Thanksgiving betrayal, but the years of subtle and not so subtle neglect. My mother's death, my father's resentment, Natalie's games, the way I had contorted myself to be palatable, quiet, forgiving. A therapist said something during one session that I'll never forget. You've been grieving a family that never existed the way you needed it to. That line broke me open. Because it was true, I had always held on to hope that one day they'd see me, love me, apologize, and when that hope died, I didn't know who I was without it. So we started over. I wrote more, doodled again, painted with cheap watercolors late at night while soft music played in the background. I let myself create, not to impress anyone, but to feel human again. I reconnected with two friends I had slowly drifted from. Emma and Lucia. They didn't ask for explanations, they just showed up, brought over Thai food, watched bad rom-coms, let me cry, let me laugh again. I started cooking real meals again, not just microwave leftovers or cereal. It sounds silly, but feeding myself felt like an act of rebellion, like telling the world, I matter, I deserve warmth. I still had moments of weakness, days when I woke up angry or hollow, nights when I wondered what would have happened if I had just stayed quiet and invited them all to the wedding. Would it have been easier? But then I'd remember how it felt to finally choose myself, how it felt when my grandfather called, voice steady, and said, "I'm proud of you for walking away." That kept me going. Healing didn't happen in one grand breakthrough. It came slowly, in little acts of defiance and self-love, a cup of tea, a long walk, turning off my phone for the weekend, saying no without guilt. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for someone else to rescue me. I was rescuing myself. Some days, I still woke up with the ache of being unloved by the people who were supposed to love me first. But I was learning to replace that ache with something else. Resolve. Resolve to build something new, something better, something mine. It wasn't a big moment, no grand realization, no cinematic breakthrough, just a Wednesday morning in early spring, sunlight streaming through my blinds, and the simple decision to make coffee and open the window. That's all. But something in that small act felt like resistance, like I was choosing to let life in again. Healing had begun months earlier, slowly and almost imperceptibly, but that morning was the first time I noticed it. I'd started waking up with a little less weight on my chest. The silence in my apartment no longer felt suffocating. I could breathe, cook, and laugh at something stupid online. I could go days without thinking about Natalie or my father. Part of this shift came from therapy. With each session, I started untangling the lies I'd internalized, that I was unlovable, that I was the problem, that I deserved less. I began to see my life not through their lens, but through my own. It wasn't easy. There were weeks I wanted to quit, days when I left therapy feeling more raw than healed. But the work was working. I started building new habits. I signed up for a weekend pottery class, something I had wanted to do since college but never felt allowed to prioritize. I thought I'd be awkward and terrible at it, and I was. But I loved it. I loved the mess, the imperfection, the tactile joy of shaping something with my hands. I began walking in the mornings before work, just 15 minutes around the block, earbuds in, music playing softly. It became a ritual, a time to connect with myself before the world barged in. One evening, Emma invited me to a gallery opening. I almost said no out of habit, but something inside me whispered, "Go." So I did. And that night, I met Julian. He wasn't flashy or loud, just like Daniel had been, but there was something different. Julian wasn't trying to charm anyone. He asked thoughtful questions, listened closely, and laughed with his whole face. We exchanged numbers, and over the next few months, we built something that felt steady, safe, unlike anything I'd known before. I told him everything eventually, about Natalie, about my father, about Thanksgiving and what came after. I waited for the look, the one people give when they think your past makes you damaged, but it never came. He just held my hand and said, "I'm glad you're here." It wasn't just Julian. My circle, though small, became a sanctuary. Emma, Lucia, my therapist, and even my pottery classmates reminded me, in small ways, that family could be chosen. Even my grandfather, steady, unwavering, called every Sunday without fail. "You're doing good, kid," he'd say. "Don't let the bastards wear you down." I learned to say no without guilt, to turn off my phone when I needed space, to take breaks without apology. Start saving money again, started dreaming again. I made a vision board not because I thought it was magic, but because I wanted to see hope on paper. I wanted to remind myself that my future didn't have to look like my past. And eventually the pain stopped feeling like the main character in my story. It became background noise. Still there, but no longer calling the shots. Julian and I moved in together after a year. He helped me repaint the walls of my apartment. We picked out furniture together, built bookshelves, argued over rug colors. It felt absurdly domestic, and I loved it. One morning, while sipping coffee in our half-decorated living room, he looked at me and said, "You know, I could see myself marrying you." I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I smiled because for the first time, I believed I deserved that kind of love. Not as redemption, not as a rescue, but because I had done the work, because I had chosen myself again and again until the life I wanted finally chose me back. Not long after, something surprising happened. My father got sick. It was sudden, a mild stroke that left him weak and confused. Natalie didn't call me. It was my grandfather who told me, his voice grave but steady. "He's in the hospital. I thought you should know." I didn't rush there. I sat with the news first. The old me would have dropped everything, out of guilt, out of obligation. But the new me, the one I'd fought to become, took a moment to decide. Eventually, I went, not for him, but for myself. He looked smaller in the hospital bed, older, frail in a way I wasn't prepared for. For a second, the resentment cracked. Beneath it was something I didn't expect, sorrow, not for him exactly, but for what we never had. He didn't say much that day, just nodded when I entered the room. But in the days that followed, I showed up. I helped coordinate care, paid a bill his insurance didn't cover, and brought him soup. Natalie visited once or twice, posted a selfie from his hospital room, then vanished again. It was during that time, when I was quietly helping, expecting nothing, that my father began to change. One evening, he looked at me and said, "You didn't have to do all this." I shrugged, "I know." And for once, he didn't follow it with blame or sarcasm, just silence. Grateful, complicated silence. That moment didn't fix everything, but it mattered because it came from me, someone who had learned to love without losing herself. And that was enough. For a while, it seemed like things with him were improving. After his health scare and the time we spent rebuilding awkwardly, slowly, but sincerely, I thought maybe, just maybe, he was finally starting to see me, respect me. Maybe he even loved me. So when Julian and I got engaged, I didn't hesitate to call him. He sounded happy, proud even. He asked about the venue, the dress, and the guest list. It felt like we were having the kind of conversations I used to daydream about. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to imagine my father walking me down the aisle. I imagined it would mean something, that it would be a symbol of how far we'd come. But then, 3 weeks before the wedding, he called me with a condition. "If you're serious about healing the family," he said, "you'll invite your sister." I went silent. He continued, "She's still your sister. Blood is blood. This wedding is a chance to move on. She wants to be there." Helms laughed. "She wants to be there?" I repeated. "She hasn't spoken to me since she slept with my boyfriend?" "She made mistakes," he said, "but it's been years." "Don't punish her forever." Punish her as if her absence from my wedding was a sentence instead of a boundary. "I'm not punishing her," I said quietly. "I'm protecting myself." That didn't go over well. He tried every trick, guilt, logic, even nostalgia. "Your mother would have wanted all of us there," he said. I snapped. "You'll get to use her." The conversation ended with a new ultimatum. If Natalie wasn't invited, he wouldn't come. He wouldn't walk me down the aisle. He said it would be too painful to sit there knowing his family was divided. What about the pain I carried, the pain I lived with for decades while he turned a blind eye? I took a day to think. I cried, I raged, I vented to Julian, I called my therapist, and then I made my decision. I called my grandfather. "Would you walk me down the aisle?" I asked. There was no pause. It would be my honor. So I took my father off the guest list, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. And when the wedding day came, I felt light, nervous, but whole. I stood in the back of the venue, arm looped through my grandfather's, the music beginning to swell. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded. As we walked, I saw the faces of people who had chosen me, friends, mentors, chosen family. I didn't feel the absence of those who weren't there. I felt the presence of those who were. Julian was waiting at the altar, eyes full of tears and love. Later, during the reception, my grandfather surprised everyone. He tapped his glass with a fork, stood, and said, "There's something I want to give the bride and groom." I froze. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a set of keys. "These belong to the lake house," he said. "It's yours now." Gasps filled the room. I covered my mouth in shock. He smiled. "Out of all my family, you've shown me what loyalty looks like. You've shown me what it means to forgive and to rise. I know you'll make good memories there." I hugged him so hard I thought I'd break. The house had always been my father's assumed inheritance. Everyone thought it would go to him, but now it was mine, a gift, not just of property, but of validation. The fallout came quickly. The next day, my father called, furious. "How dare you let my father walk you down the aisle?" he shouted. "How dare you steal what's mine?" I didn't flinch. "You made your choice," I said. "I made mine." He went on a rant about entitlement, betrayal, disrespect. I let him finish. Then I said, "You taught me all my life to believe I didn't deserve anything, but I do. I deserve this." And I hung up. Natalie wasn't far behind. She messaged me on social media, accusing me of manipulating grandpa, of ruining the family, of being a selfish brat. I blocked her because that day at the altar, when I chose who would stand beside me, I didn't just pick a person. I picked a future, one where I wasn't begging for crumbs, one where I wasn't shrinking to keep others comfortable. That day, I didn't just become a wife, I became free. In the days that followed, I received messages from extended family, some shocked, some supportive, others pretending to be neutral. A few tried to guilt me into reconciliation, saying, "You only have one father," or "Family is everything." But they hadn't lived my life. They hadn't stood in my shoes, hadn't cried in their bedrooms while laughter happened in the next room. They didn't know what it was like to be blamed for being born. Julian, steady as ever, reminded me blood is not the same as love. And he was right. I framed a photo from the wedding, me in my dress, arm in arm with my grandfather, both of us smiling with full hearts. I put it on my desk, a daily reminder that I chose truth over tradition, that I didn't need approval from people who had never really seen me. The power of that choice didn't just change my wedding, it changed my life. 3 months after the wedding, I got a text. It was from my dad. No demands, no guilt tripping, just 4 words. "Can we meet up?" I sat there, staring at it. My thumb hovered over the screen. Delete it, I thought. Just block him. But my hands didn't move. Not yet. I wasn't the same girl who had begged for his attention or cried in bed after every cold dismissal. I had changed. I was married now, living in a home filled with warmth and respect. I had boundaries, but some part of me, still bruised but stronger, wanted to know what he had to say. I didn't answer right away. I needed time. Julian found me in the kitchen later that night, the phone still in my hand. He took one look at my face and asked, "He reached out?" I nodded. What do you want to do?" he asked gently. I shook my head. "I don't know." And that was the truth. I didn't know if I wanted closure or distance. I didn't know if I was ready to face him again or if I'd be reopening a wound I'd fought hard to heal. I brought it up in therapy the next morning. My therapist listened, then said, "You're not who you were. Facing him now isn't about seeking his love. It's about honoring your own strength." So I texted back, "Okay, 1 hour, a public place." We met at a park bench not far from where he used to take Natalie for ice cream when we were kids. Funny, I thought, how memories could both sting and feel hollow at the same time. He was already there when I arrived. Thinner, paler. He stood when he saw me, but didn't reach out. We just nodded at each other, like strangers pretending we shared something deeper. Thanks for coming, he said. I sat down, keeping a safe distance. What did you want to say? He looked away, chewing on the inside of his cheek. I knew that look. He did it when he was nervous. I've been thinking, he began, about what happened. The wedding, Natalie, the house. I raised an eyebrow, and? He sighed. I was wrong. I wasn't ready for that. Not because I didn't want to hear it, but because I didn't trust it. Not yet. I didn't protect you, he continued. I let Natalie get away with too much. I let myself blame you for things you never caused. You mean like mom dying? I asked, voice sharper than I intended. His eyes flicked to mine, but he didn't flinch. Yes. For once, he didn't deflect. He didn't try to justify it. He just looked down at his hands and said, I've carried guilt for a long time. And I made you carry it with me. I'm sorry. I stayed quiet, let the words settle. I thought, he added, if we could be at your wedding together, like some picture-perfect family, maybe it would fix things. But that wasn't fair to you. No, I said. It wasn't. He nodded slowly. You don't owe me anything. I know that, but I'd like to try. To be better. To show up, if not as your father, then maybe just someone who finally sees you. I looked at him for a long time. I don't need a dad, I said. I needed one when I was 5, when I was 12, when I caught Natalie with my ex. But now, I need peace. I need honesty. I can try to give you that, he said. We didn't hug. We didn't promise anything. But when I walked away from that bench, I didn't feel shattered. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt clear. Later that week, I received a letter in the mail. It was from him, handwritten, 6 pages. Inside were memories, confessions, regret. He told me he'd kept one of my drawings from preschool in his wallet for years. Even when he couldn't look me in the eye, he said he remembered the first time I laughed. Really laughed. And how much it sounded like my mom. I cried when I read it. Not because I forgave him, but because for the first time he wasn't hiding behind excuses. And that, for me, was enough for now. I tucked the letter into a box in my closet, alongside my wedding vows, my mother's photo, and the key to the lake house. Proof that healing doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it's just choosing to sit on a bench and tell the truth. Almost a year has passed since my wedding, and in that time, I've come to understand something I never really grasped before. Peace isn't something you find, it's something you build. It's early morning as I write this. Julian is still asleep, one arm draped over our dog, who now claims half our bed like it's his birthright. The lake is quiet, mist floating above the water like something from a dream. I'm sitting on the porch with coffee in hand, wearing the robe my mom wore in the only photo I have of her holding Natalie. Funny how things come full circle. A year ago, I stood at a threshold between past and future, pain and possibility. I didn't know if I was making the right choice by cutting out my father and sister. I only knew I couldn't keep living in a story where I was always the villain for existing. Now I look around and I see the life I've chosen. The lake house, my grandfather's gift, has become a haven, not just for me and Julian, but for something larger. I host weekend retreats for women like me, daughters who were blamed, sisters who were betrayed, and women who've been gaslit into silence. We paint, we walk, we talk late into the night, and slowly we remember that our stories matter, even the messy ones. My father reaches out sometimes, a cautious text here, a holiday card there. I don't respond often. When I do, it's brief, cordial, nothing more. And that's okay. I've let go of the idea that closure must come from the person who hurt you. Sometimes closure is the decision to stop waiting for an apology that may never come and to live joyfully anyway. As for Natalie, she's vanished completely. Last I heard, she moved across the country. I don't follow up. I don't need to know. Her absence is a kind of freedom. Julian remains my anchor, my calm, the first person who ever made me feel like I didn't have to earn love by shrinking myself. He fills our home with music, burns pancakes on purpose just to make me laugh, and leaves notes in my pockets like we're still dating. The photo of my mother hangs above our fireplace now. I painted it from memory, and the one photo I had, every time I light a fire, I feel like she's here, watching, smiling, maybe proud. It took me a long time to understand that being loved doesn't mean being chosen by the people who are supposed to love you. It means choosing yourself. It means building something beautiful from the wreckage. This is my real inheritance, not the lake house, not the forgiveness from my father, not even the justice I once dreamed, but this peace, this soft, quiet joy. This morning light spilled across a hardwood floor. This man who loves me. This home feels like mine. In this voice, finally mine to use, not to beg, but to tell the truth. If you're still in the middle of your own story, hurting, doubting, wondering if it ever gets better, this is for you. It does. One brave choice at a time. And sometimes all it takes is closing the wrong door to find the right one wide open.